Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. We're honored to have with us Michaela Dodge. She's a Senior Policy Analyst, Defense and Strategic Policy at the Heritage Foundation. She specializes in missile defense, nuclear weapons modernization, arms control as policy analyst for the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center. She's authored or co-authored research papers and commentary for Heritage. She's an expert in her field. She holds a Master of Science degree in Defense and Strategic Studies from Missouri State University. Grew up in the Czech Republic, doing great work for Heritage now. Michaela, thank you for being on the Joe Miller Show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So one of the issues that we've been talking about on the Joe Miller Show over the last week is the issue of the Iran deal and how it's going to create potentially a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. We've got you on just for one segment. I want to talk about that as well as also issues of modernization of America's nuclear force and whether or not that's necessary or happening. But let's focus first on the Middle East. Is there rational concern about a nuclear arms race in the Middle East in the wake of this Iran deal?
Absolutely there is, mostly because the deal leaves Iranian infrastructure in place. What it means is that Iran will be able to continue to enrich uranium. It will be able to keep its nuclear facilities. It will obtain advance notice for inspections, and all of these elements make deal concerning and make deal somewhat dangerous for us and our allies.
Well, I just saw an article on Fox News that suggested, I guess Kerry responded to concern that some have that the Iran deal doesn't provide for anytime, anywhere inspections. And he actually confirms that that was actually never on the table, that they never actually expected that result from the agreement with Iran. Is the Obama administration just flat out lying about this agreement having any real limits on the nuclear program in Iran?
Well, the Obama administration officials qualified the statement, so it is not entirely anytime, anywhere. But I do think that the at least 24-day notice to Iran to conduct inspections is just too much, because you can move these programs, you can hide them, and Iran is a state that repeatedly lied about its program and developed it covertly. And so what you would want to have is more stringent verification regime, not less, and the deal does not achieve it.
24 days. I mean, that's just outrageous. I mean, has there ever been any other nuclear deal with any other country that provided for such a length of advance notice for inspection?
You know, the inspections are always a matter of negotiation, and there is a separate process between the IAEA and the host state, and the host state has to agree to everything. Well, in the past, Iran refused to agree to even bare minimum. Under this disguise, it developed a nuclear program, and now we are rewarding Iran for developing and defying the international community and the United States with giving them a really sweet deal on their nuclear program.
And so they're going to be able to continue to advance research and development. It's pretty clear to most observers that the objective has been, at least in part, for nuclear weapons. What is that going to do to other nation states in the Middle East that are seeking, regional power status? Are they going to compete also on the nuclear side now?
It would not be surprising. Saudi Arabia said that it wants the very same deal that Iran is getting. That would be just incredibly destabilizing. Iran is getting better deal than our allies in Taiwan or in South Korea, despite the fact that it has such a terrible history of lying about the program. But let's not also forget the nature of the Iranian regime. They're one of the major sponsors of terrorism in the Middle East, causing many problems for the United States and allies. And the deal improves their ability and gives them more resources to be destabilizing actor in the Middle East.
And in addition to that, they get $150 billion released, which will allow them to, that's hard currency. That's money that they haven't had access to before. From the U.S. perspective, that's not a lot of cash, but for a country like Iran, they'll be able to do a lot of devastating work with that, probably not only with respect to funding terrorist groups like Hezbollah, but also helping to develop even further their nuclear program, right?
Absolutely. Some analyzed the amount of money and equated it to 1/3 of their economy of money that Iran will have free hands to play with. But not only that, even worse, Iran will be able to spend this money on advanced technologies that are currently sanctioned, because those technologies and weapons are going away too. And some states, like Russia, are eager to deal with Iran, and they're eager to sell their weapons. It is yet another way in which the deal is just incredibly destabilizing for the region and for the United States.
So Russia's perspective, of course, they want the currency that they get through the weapons deals, but don't you think that they have risk as well in providing that kind of technology to Iran? I mean, they could ultimately be on the wrong side of Iran in the future, or do they just think that that's not a possibility?
Their common interest is lack of appreciation for the United States and certain adversarial relationship with the United States. And so Russia and Iran are almost natural enemies. Now, Russia is stand to lose some money from cheaper oil prices, theoretically, should Iran supply its cheap oil or relatively cheap oil to the world market. So another question is, what is Russia getting in return? They would not agree to a deal that would damage its interests in any way. Not Vladimir Putin's Russia. We cannot agree on almost anything, yet we can agree on the Iran deal. There is something fishy about that.
Yeah, it's a very disconcerting, and especially, I guess, in view of the fact that it doesn't seem like there's any positives for the United States at all. Can you tell us what the Obama administration is seeing in this? Other than his legacy, is there really anything that they can point to that's a positive for American interests out of this deal?
Under the assumption that Iran will over-comply with the deal, which, by the way, itself is very ambiguous as to what Iran can actually do or cannot do and subject to further negotiations, I suppose you could make the case that Iran will allow inspections that it has been denying for years. By the way, Americans will not be allowed to be on those inspections, so there's some concern there. But it really is a terrible deal for the United States. It's a terrible deal for long-term consequences, too, because it leaves us with stronger Iran in the future. And that is just bound to limit future presidents' options should Iran decide to develop a nuclear weapon.
Well, the quirk of this whole thing, of course, now is that Iran is actually, at least in part, trying to achieve a similar aim to us in Iraq, trying to put down ISIS. Do you think that that was part of the motivating factor in doing this deal, is that we now have this new partner for peace in Iraq?
Yeah, new partner for peace in Iran. I mean, that just doesn't sound very plausible. The Iranians have their own interests. If they happen to correspond or collide with the United States, I don't think that's a kind of a defining factor. I don't think it's their defining factor whether their interests in ISIS correspond with those of the United States. In reality, Iran
Yeah, a lot of us are just trying to figure out why in the world the Obama administration would do this, unless, of course, the main motivating factor for the Obama administration is doing things that hurt the United States interest. I mean, I can see some consistency there, but there just doesn't seem to be much logic in the deal, and it's really unfortunate that we're now entering a new period of even more instability in the Middle East region. And, of course, it will have longer and also more widespread consequences. Another subject area, we've got about 5 minutes left in the segment. The American nuclear arsenal, there's been some concern that it is slipping into disrepair, that we are not modernizing it, despite the fact that there are real threats out there that could require the use of those forces, or at least the effectiveness known of those forces to ensure that there isn't some sort of real threat in the future from one of our competitors. Do you see the American nuclear force as needing improvement? Are we where we ought to be? Are we below par? Tell us your assessment.
My assessment is that we are decades behind where we need to be. Every other nuclear weapon state is modernizing nuclear weapons. Our potential adversaries, Russia and China, are building new nuclear warheads. We just life extend warheads that were built in 1970s. Our nuclear platforms are old, and all of this adds up to very serious concern about our nuclear triad.
So this must have started, I mean, the falling into disrepair of our nuclear force under the previous administration. Bush, does he have some responsibility for this?
Oh, absolutely. Since just about the end of the Cold War, we as a nation have stopped paying attention to our nuclear weapons infrastructure. We have stopped paying attention to our nuclear warheads. We kept extending our nuclear delivery platforms, some of which were designed for 10-year operational lifetimes. And so I would go even further way back than the Bush administration. But bills are coming due, and we have to come together as a nation and really understand that nuclear weapons are important for our security and that for future too.
Well, and of course, that's not a popular subject in the United States. Everybody thinks that, the era of Cold War competition is over, that we're only focused now on small regional conflicts, that, ultimate conflict between, major powers like China and the United States or Russia and the United States won't happen. But our competitors are thinking differently. Can you tell our audience a little bit about, for example, the Chinese modernization program, what they've actually poured into their nuclear weapons program over the last 10 or 15 years?
Chinese have massive nuclear weapons production infrastructure. They have knowledge base. They have resources. They have tunnels that make their nuclear forces more survivable. They test their nuclear warheads, unlike the United States. It's really concerning seeing what those countries are making with their nuclear forces.
So the fact that we have not tested our weapons, and of course the explanation that was given, I know, during the Bush administration was that, well, we've got supercomputers that can model the testing, so we really don't have to do real-world testing. And they tried to assure the American public that, through that approach, that the nuclear force was being maintained appropriately. Do you agree?
Our nuclear weapon laboratories are doing an excellent job within parameters of the policy. The policy is flawed. The problem with computer codes is that sometimes you make errors that even out. There are things that you don't know about your nuclear warheads and that you're not going to find out just using computer codes. And it is really serious concern for the future. And as we move forward, what do we do with our nuclear warheads?
So shifting over to Russia, you talked a little bit about the Chinese advancement, development of nuclear weapons. Is Russia continuing to modernize its force?
Absolutely. Since New START entered into force, Russia has launched the most extensive nuclear weapons modernization program since the end of the Cold War. It's been increasing its nuclear warheads. They're having new ballistic missiles come online. They repeatedly threaten the United States and our NATO allies with nuclear attacks. And so far, we don't have good responses to those actions.
Right. And then, of course, we also have the specter of some of these other nuclear powers, smaller nuclear powers, continuing their efforts, too. I haven't heard much about Pakistan recently. By some estimates, they have 100 to 200 nuclear weapons. Are they continuing to maintain their force, or are they pretty static at this point?
I am not an expert on the Pakistani nuclear program. I don't know as much about it. But the key concern was relationship between India and Pakistan and potential for nuclear escalation. And I do think that remains in the cards, too.
Well, it's certainly a dangerous world that we live in, and people that put their heads in the sand and say, hey, it's a different era, we only have to be worried about these small regional conflicts, not competition between the world powers, they're just out of their minds, especially looking at what China is doing, what Russia is doing. They're developing, they're continuing to pour money into a potential conflict with the United States, especially China. And our leadership that sits there and ignores it, they need to be held to account because they're putting all of us at risk. This country needs to get off its butt and be concerned about national security. Michaela Dodge from the Heritage, I appreciate your insight on all of this. Thank you for sharing your expertise. We'll try to get this podcasted, by the way, for those of you who might have missed the first part of it. at youtube.com, Joe Miller US. Thanks again, Ms. Dodge.
Thank you so much, Joe. Have a nice evening.
You too.